Night. A mountain road somewhere in the Peloponnese. A man is running, and he has been running since before dawn. The skin on his feet is worn through what is left of his sandals. He does not slow down. He cannot. Behind him, on a beach near Athens, the largest empire the world has ever seen is unloading its army onto Greek soil. Ahead of him lies the only city that can stop it, and it is still a full day's run away. His name was Pheidippides, and the run that made his name immortal, the one every marathon on Earth is named for, almost certainly never happened the way you have been told. The run that did happen was nearly twice as long, and he made it before the battle, not after. Every spring, runners in Boston, in London, in New York cover 26.2 miles in his memory. They are honoring the wrong run. And the war he was racing to stop drew a line between East and West that still shapes how America talks about the Middle East today. You have probably run his race or cheered for someone who did. You have never been told the truth about it. The year is 490 BC. The Persian Empire is the largest the world has ever known, stretching from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean, across 3 continents and dozens of conquered nations. Its roads were so good that a royal courier could carry a message from one end to the other in a week, neither snow nor rain nor darkness stopping the relay. By some counts, the empire ruled a larger share of the human race than any power before or since. Close to half the people then alive answered, in the end, to one man, Darius, the King of Kings. Against all of that stood a single city. Athens could put perhaps 10,000 men into the field who owned armor and knew how to use it. 10,000 against an empire of millions. But Darius had not crossed the sea for territory. He had crossed it for revenge. Years before, Athens had sent 20 ships to help the Greek cities of Asia rise against him, and in the chaos, the city of Sardis, one of the jewels of his empire, had burned to the ground. Herodotus tells us the king was so consumed by it that he ordered a servant to stand behind him at every meal and say 3 times the same words, "Master, remember the Athenians." He remembered. A year before the invasion, he had sent heralds across Greece demanding earth and water, the tokens of surrender. Most cities, terrified, handed them over. Athens did not. Athens threw the king's heralds into a pit and told them to dig their own earth and water out of the bottom. Sparta threw theirs down a well. It was an unforgivable insult, and both cities knew exactly what it would summon across the sea. It came under his generals Datis and Artaphernes. The fleet crossed the Aegean island by island. It reached Eretria, a city that had also sent ships against him, and after 6 days a traitor opened the gates from inside. The Persians burned its temples to ash and marched its people away in chains to be resettled near the king's own capital on the far side of the world. The message to Athens was simple. This is what defiance costs. Then the ships turned toward Athens and put the army ashore on a wide coastal plain about 26 miles from the city, a plain called Marathon. Why there, of all places? Because the Persians were not sailing blind. They were guided by an Athenian, Hippias, the old tyrant the city had thrown out a generation before. He was gray-haired now, an exile, still dreaming of the throne he had lost, and he had chosen that beach himself. It was flat and open, perfect ground for the cavalry that made the Persian army unbeatable. If this is the kind of history you came looking for, subscribe. This is exactly the story this channel was built to tell.
The later writers would swell the Persian host to 600,000 men. That is a fantasy. But even the soberest modern guess leaves the Athenians outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1 on open ground against horsemen and archers they had no answer for. Hippias had chosen well, and that choice would become the first of the empire's mistakes.
Athens understood the arithmetic. 10,000 citizens could not hold the line against the empire alone. There was only one army in the Greek world that might tip the scale: the Spartans, the most feared soldiers anyone had ever met. But Sparta lay nearly 150 miles to the south, on the far side of a wall of mountains. So Athens reached for the fastest thing it owned. Not a horse. A mountain road can break a horse. A man. Pheidippides was a hemerodromos, a day runner, one of a small breed of professional couriers trained to carry messages across punishing distances on foot, through country no rider could cross. They pointed him south and told him the survival of the city was now in his legs. He ran it, about 150 miles over mountain passes, and he reached Sparta the day after he left Athens. Sit with that for a moment. Roughly 6 marathons, back to back, across mountains, in something close to a day and a half. No road crew, no water stations, no sleep. For centuries, readers assumed Herodotus had simply exaggerated. No human body could do that. Then, in 1982, a British Air Force officer named John Foden and a handful of companions decided to find out, and ran the route themselves to test it. They made it. Today, an ultra-marathon called the Spartathlon retraces those 153 miles every single year, and the fastest runners finish in around 25 hours. The impossible old story turned out to be plain fact. Somewhere on the lonely slopes of Mount Parthenium, Pheidippides later swore, the god Pan called him by name. The god asked why the Athenians gave him no honors, though he wished them well and would help them once again. Pheidippides did not stop to argue with the god. He ran on, delivered his message to the Spartan leaders, and waited for the answer that would decide everything. The answer was yes, but not yet. It was the season of a sacred festival, the Carnea. Spartan law forbade the army from marching to war before the moon was full, and the full moon was still 6 days away. They would come. They simply would not break their own sacred law to save another city. History likes to picture Sparta as the iron heart of Greece. At the single moment that iron mattered most, it stayed home for a religious holiday. I do not think that made them cowards. It made them exactly who they always were, and it left Athens standing alone. Pheidippides turned around and ran the 150 miles back, carrying the worst news a man can carry. Sparta was coming. But it would arrive to a city that had already won or already fallen. He had run 300 miles in a handful of days, spoken with a god on a mountainside, and bought Athens nothing but the certainty that no one was coming. Whatever Athens was going to do, it would have to do alone. And what it chose to do next would rewrite the rules of war. The Athenian army marched out to Marathon and looked down on the plain. What they saw should have ended the argument. The Persian force outnumbered them, backed by cavalry and waves of archers, with hundreds of ships waiting at its back. For days, the two armies simply watched each other across the open ground, and most of the Greek generals wanted to keep waiting, to fall back behind the walls of the city. One man refused. His name was Miltiades. and he held a strange qualification for the job. He had once lived under Persian rule and fought in Persian service. He knew how this enemy moved. He knew what it feared. And he knew that every day of waiting only gave the Persians time to sail around the coast and seize an empty Athens from behind. The whole decision came down to a single vote, cast by the war archon Callimachus. Miltiades won it. And then, the moment the Persian cavalry was out of position, he did something that looked, to everyone watching, like suicide. A Greek phalanx normally fought as one even wall of shields and spears. Miltiades deliberately thinned out his center and stacked his strongest men on the two wings. Then he gave an order no Greek army had ever given against Persia. Advance across the open plain at a run, the last stretch straight into a sky going black with arrows. The Persians had never seen anything like it. They were used to enemies who froze at the sight of them. These men were sprinting toward them, screaming in bronze. The thin center buckled, exactly as he had planned. The Persians poured into the gap, certain they were winning the battle. And then the powerful Greek wings wheeled inward and closed around them like a fist. The most feared army on earth found itself surrounded by farmers, potters, and shopkeepers in bronze, and it broke. The Persians ran for their ships across the marshes, and many drowned in the mud they could not see beneath them. The cost was real. The war archon Callimachus died on the wing he commanded. A man named Cynaegirus grabbed the stern of a Persian ship to stop it leaving, and had his hand cut off. His brother fought beside him that day, a young soldier named Aeschylus, who would go on to become the greatest playwright of the age, and who asked that his tombstone mention Marathon and not a single one of his plays. When it was over, Herodotus gives us the count. The Persians left around 6,400 dead on the field. The Athenians lost 192. 192 men had broken an empire. Before you go on, tell me in the comments, who do you think the real hero of Marathon was? Hold that answer. By the end of this, I think it changes. Because the killing had stopped, but the danger had not. Out on the water, the Persian fleet was already turning, rowing hard for the south. Toward a city its army had left almost completely undefended. This is the part the legend leaves out. While the Athenian soldiers stood bleeding on the plain, the Persian ships were rounding the coast, racing for Athens itself. The army that had just fought a battle now had to win a second race, on foot, in full armor, against a navy. And there is a darker thread woven through it. Herodotus reports that as the fleet pulled away, a polished shield flashed from a mountainside, like a mirror in the sun, a signal to the Persians that the city was theirs for the taking. Someone inside Greece may have been betraying it. Suspicion fell on one of the great Athenian families. The charge was never proven. The whisper never fully died. So the Athenians did the only thing left to do. They marched. The entire victorious army, still carrying shields and spears, covered the 26 miles back to Athens and reached the city before the Persians could land. When the fleet finally came around the headland and saw Greek soldiers already lined along the shore, ready to do it all again, the Persians made the only sane choice. They turned the ships around and sailed home. That is the real marathon. Not one runner, an entire army, refusing to rest until their wives and children were safe. So where does the dying messenger come from? Centuries later, Long after everyone who fought had turned to dust, Greek and Roman writers began telling a different story of a lone runner who sprinted from Marathon to Athens, gasped out a single word, "We have won," and dropped dead where he stood. One writer called him Thersippus, another called him Eucles. It was the satirist Lucian, some 600 years after the battle, who finally pinned the death run on a man named Pheidippides. Over time, the real courier and the dying legend melted into a single figure, and the legend is what the modern world chose to keep. When the first modern Olympics opened in Athens in 1896, a French scholar named Michel Bréal suggested inventing a brand new race to honor that final, doubtful sprint. And a Greek water carrier named Spiridon Louis won it and woke up a national hero. The exact distance, 26.2 miles, was not even fixed until the London Games of 1908 lengthened, the story goes, so the route could start beneath the windows of Windsor Castle and finish in front of the royal box. A myth edited for a king's convenience. Most retellings turn Pheidippides into a tragic hero who ran himself to death for a message. I think that quietly shrinks the truth into something you can stamp on a medal. The real story is not one man dying. It is 10,000 men who won an impossible battle and then refused to stop moving until their city was safe. That is harder to romanticize. It is also the part worth remembering. But the deepest mark Marathon left on the world is not a race at all. It is a line, drawn on no map, but in the way an entire civilization learned to see itself. For 2,500 years, the West has told Marathon as its own origin story. Free men governing themselves, standing on a beach and turning back the greatest empire on earth. That one image, citizens against a king, liberty against the lash, a vote against a throne, became the founding myth of what Europeans, and later Americans, would proudly call the West. Herodotus himself, writing a generation later, framed the whole war as a clash between two worlds, Europe against Asia, Greek against barbarian. He gave the conflict a shape, and the shape never went away. The philosopher John Stuart Mill once wrote that the Battle of Marathon, even as an event in English history, was more important than the Battle of Hastings. He was not really talking about Greece. He was talking about an inheritance he believed his own country had received. For centuries, European empires looked back at that beach and saw themselves, the rational, free, civilized few, holding the line against the teeming East. They taught it in their schools as the moment we began. Every time you have watched a movie about a small band of free Greeks holding off a faceless Eastern horde, the 300 at the mountain pass, the spears against the endless army, you have watched the same myth, 10 years older and dressed in newer armor. Marathon wrote the template. Everything after it was a sequel. And here's where it reaches you, in your own century. When you hear a leader frame a conflict as freedom against tyranny, the civilized world against a hostile, despotic East, the people against the strong man, they are reaching, knowingly or not, for a script first written in the sand at Marathon. It is one of the oldest and most powerful stories the West knows how to tell about itself. We are the small, free, righteous side, and the threat always comes from the East. Persia did not vanish that day. It absorbed the loss and stayed the dominant power of its world for another century and a half, until a Macedonian named Alexander finally tore it down. And Persia has an air that is very much alive. We call it Iran, the modern nation that sits on the old Persian heartland, that speaks a language descended from Darius's own, and that still claims that ancient lineage with open pride. So when the West casts Iran as the looming empire across the water, and itself as the embattled defender of freedom, it is reaching for a role it first wrote 25 centuries ago, on the exact stretch of coast where Pheidippides once stood and watched the enemy come ashore. Think about how the standoff with Iran is described on the news tonight. An ancient civilization with imperial ambitions set against a coalition that calls itself the free world. Strip away the missiles and the headlines, and the shape of the story is identical to the one a Greek courier was running to keep alive. The names change. The map redraws itself. The story stays the same. That is why a battle older than almost anything you can name still echoes in this week's headlines. If you have followed the story this far, you already understand what this channel is for. So subscribe and ring the bell, and the next empire we follow will begin exactly where this one ends. Now look back at that beach one more time, because the story is not finished telling on you. Today, marathons are run in thousands of cities all over the world. More than 1 million people finish one every single year. In New York, in Tokyo, in Berlin, in towns you have never heard of. Almost none of them aware that they are reenacting a story 2,500 years old, and a version of it that, by the only account written by anyone close to the time, never happened at all. World records, lifelong dreams, billion-dollar industries, an entire global ritual of human endurance, all of it built on a beautiful legend about a man who probably never made that final run. Meanwhile, the run that did happen, the brutal 150 miles to Sparta, is repeated each year by only a few hundred ultra-runners hard enough to know the real story. The world chose to remember the easy myth and forget the impossible truth. It almost always does. But here is the harder truth, the one the founding myth carefully leaves out. The freedom against empire story has another side, and that side never agreed to it. To the Persians, Marathon was not the dawn of anything. It was a minor reverse on the distant western edge of their map, a frontier skirmish against some quarrelsome hill tribes, quickly absorbed, barely worth a line in the royal archives. The battle the West treats as the birth of civilization was, seen from the other shore, a footnote at the very end of the world. There is no Persian monument at Marathon. There is no shrine in Tehran to the men who fell there. For 2,500 years, only one side has been telling this story, the side that won, and then kept winning, and then wrote the textbooks. That is worth sitting with the next time you are told with total confidence who the heroes of history were and who the villains. History is not just written by the winners. It is run by them, mile after mile, year after year, until the legend is the only version anyone can still remember how to tell. Whose story you believe depends entirely on which end of history you happen to be standing at. And that single, uncomfortable idea that the very same event can be a sacred turning point to one people and a forgotten footnote to another is the thing almost everyone misses about Marathon. Somewhere, right now, you are the footnote in someone else's epic. It is also the thing that explains far more about the world you live in than any battlefield map ever could. But before we close, there is one debt left unpaid: what the city did to the man who saved it. So let the threads come back together. The god Pan kept his promise, at least in Athenian eyes. After the battle, the city carved a shrine into the rock beneath the Acropolis and honored him every year, a small cave you can still find in Athens today, the lasting echo of one exhausted runner's vision on a dark mountainside. Hippias, the exiled tyrant who chose that beach, never got his throne back. Herodotus says that on the morning of the landing he sneezed, and a tooth fell out into the sand, and he took it as an omen that the only Athenian soil he would ever hold was that single tooth. He was right. He died soon after, still in flight, having steered an empire into the worst defeat of its age. The Spartans did come, arriving a day after the battle was over. They walked the plain in silence, studied the Persian dead with a soldier's quiet respect, told the Athenians they had done well, and went home. And the city of Plataea, which had sent its entire army of 1,000 men to stand beside Athens when no one else would, was honored for generations afterward. At the great festivals, the herald prayed aloud for the blessing of the gods on the Athenians and on the Plataeans. The 192 who fell were buried where they fought, beneath a great mound of earth on the plain of Marathon. That mound is still there. You can walk up and stand on it. 25 centuries of reign and war and empire have come and gone, and the grave of the men who drew the first line between East and West has never once moved. That is what an empire's defeat can leave behind. Not only ruins, a way of seeing the world that outlives every soldier who made it, and it rarely treats its heroes kindly. Miltiades, the general whose nerve had saved Greece, was dead within the year. He led one more expedition against a smaller Greek island, and it failed. He came home with a rotting wound in his leg and was put on trial by the very city he had rescued, fined a fortune he could not pay, and died of the infection in disgrace. The man who broke an empire was destroyed by a single bad campaign and his own neighbor's short memory. Persia lost one battle and carried on for generations. But the idea born on that sand outlived Persia, outlived Greece, outlived Rome, and walked straight into the language of our own century. The men faded. The story did not. A courier ran himself half to death to summon help that came too late. The army he could not save went on to save itself. And somehow the world they were all running through never stopped running after them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, share it with someone who loves a story that explains the present. Then tell me in the comments, which empire should we watch fall next? The next one is already waiting.